Hi, I'm Martin Gustafsson, a former secondary school history teacher, currently an education economist with Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and the producer of this series of videos. There's not a lot on how to deal with climate change in the history class. In fact, many think that climate change is just a matter for the geography and science class. I'll explain why the historical aspect of climate change is important and interesting too. My approach is to link climate change to how poverty rates have changed over time, as this is an important link. There's considerably less poverty today, at least in percentage terms, than there was up to around 1800, largely because of what the Industrial Revolution did to humanity, a process which in turn fundamentally changed our relationship with the atmosphere and the Earth's climate. We've reached a point where further changes in the climate threaten to worsen poverty in future. In other words, undo the gains we've seen in the last 2 centuries. So, climate change and poverty, two interrelated phenomena. These videos will include statistics and graphs. History teachers often don't deal a lot with numbers, but with this video, I hope to convince you that a better use of historical statistics, even at the secondary school level, which is the level I'm aiming at here, is both fun and beneficial. I do also go a little bit into how the statistics are produced, which in itself is interesting. The script to the videos plus detailed references to sources are available through a link below this video. The videos draw a lot from this journal article of mine published in 2024 in this South African journal dealing largely with the teaching of history. This journal is open access, so you can easily access it online. I've broken the content down into 5 periods. In the current video, there's up to 1700, basically the pre-industrial era, and then 1700 to 1820 on the beginnings of industrialization. The second video also deals with 2 periods, a long 1820 to 1950 period, when among other things poverty declined a lot in certain parts of the world, and a much shorter 1950 to 1985 period, when poverty declined further as decolonization and a green revolution set in. Finally, a third video looks at the last few decades, 1985 to 2020, a time when the science of climate change became clear, and we also saw inequality worsen. Up to around 1700, a world of tiny elites within a stable natural environment. I'm going to talk about the centuries before 1700, partly by explaining how different that period was to the 300 or so years we've experienced since 1700. We've just seen that poverty rates dropped a lot after 1800. Before then, despite changes in the fortunes of various pre-industrial empires, certain things changed very little. It's been estimated that for almost 2,000 years, around 80% of people could be considered extremely poor, compared to some 8% today. And that 80% seemed to change very little, though obviously it would have changed a bit. So what is meant by extremely poor, and how do we know what percentage of the world's population was poor? A key person here is the British economic historian Angus Maddison. He estimated average income per person going back to the year 0. Of course, for most of this period, people didn't use money, and it was only in the 20th century that countries built up statistical systems to measure the income of their populations. So, how would one know the average income per person here? Maddison's approach was to use historical sources on how people were producing food, how they lived, and how much they ate to work out roughly what their income would have been if money had been used. Of course, this kind of accounting is rough, and many have criticized the details of Maddison's methods. Yet overall, the evidence suggests that in pre-industrial times, people were on average far worse in terms of food and materials than what they are today. But extreme poverty would be experienced differently today to 1,000 years ago. Back then, it would have been more difficult to be prepared for difficult weather, say a drought, because the use of money as a form of saving was limited. Today, for the 55% of humanity living in cities, poverty arises less out of difficult weather and more out of difficult employment circumstances. Of course, up to around 1700, some 20% of people were not poor, and a small part of that 20% would have been the elite, the ruling class with considerable power. To be absolutely specific, the poverty line used for this graph is one that considers you extremely poor if you have less than $1 a day to live on, counting the purchasing power of the US dollar in 1985. This is a standard that has been used widely by the United Nations, and so it's interesting to try apply this standard to past centuries. In some ways, things were actually better in previous centuries than now. A project started around 2013 by economists such as the French Thomas Piketty and known as the World Inequality Lab has shown that for the world as a whole, inequality worsened between 1800 and 1900. Then after 1900, the world became a bit more equal, but then from around 1980, inequality began worsening again. Now, there are many ways of measuring inequality. For example, we can think of what percentage of all income is earned by the richest 10% of the population. In a completely equal society, that 10% of the population would, of course, earn 10% of all income. But in reality, to take the United States as an example, there around 46% of all income is earned by the richest 10%. This type of inequality has been getting worse since around 1980 in the world, even though poverty rates have declined. Now, how can poverty rates decline if inequality is rising, you may ask? Well, if the total amount of income grows enough, or if the cake grows enough, then those with least could end up with more cake, even if the proportion of the cake they have is less. But now, going back to the period before 1700, what's interesting is that archaeologists have looked at certain graves from around 1,000 years ago and drawn conclusions around how unequally wealth was distributed back then. They found that wealth inequality is worse today than it was 1,000 years ago. So, back here, the world was more equal than it is today, but the percentage of people who were poor was much greater. I'm going to place two more vital historical trends into this graph, apart from the poverty rate. One is carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. Ever since we invented fire around 350,000 years ago, humans have emitted carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But for most of human history, we were not burning fossil fuels like coal or oil. We were burning mostly wood. This means we maintained a more or less stable carbon cycle. In the carbon cycle, things are burnt, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but then plants, through photosynthesis, absorb that carbon dioxide. The levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere remain more or less stable, but as soon as you start extracting a lot of coal and oil or fossil fuels from beneath the ground and burn that, the carbon cycle gets upset, and we end up pushing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than can be absorbed by, say, plants and the oceans. So here are the numbers. Up to around 1600 or 1700, we burnt almost no fossil fuels. Today we burn a lot. And so we talk about the problem of emitting around 37 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year. Here I'm simplifying things a bit. For instance, if you also count methane emissions, the situation gets a bit worse. You could say that one reason there was so much poverty over most of this period is that we didn't know how to extract fossil fuels, burn them, and hence create stronger economies and more overall income. Moving to the third and final trend, the red curve shows how the human population increased dramatically in the last 200 or so years. 2,000 years ago, there were only around 190 million people in the entire world. That's a bit less than the population of Brazil today. That number did not change much until here. Today, the world's population is over 8,000 million, or 8 billion. Again, in many ways, it was our inability to exploit fossil fuels and create the industries and technologies that come out of that, which kept the human population fairly low for so many centuries. Many children died of diseases which could not be treated, and even those who survived childhood lived relatively short lives. So we see that highly unusual things happened to poverty rates, emissions by people, and the human population after around 1800, and especially after 1900. these things were all connected to the Industrial Revolution in some way. There are a few points, even in our pre-industrial history though, where historians have uncovered unusual global impacts involving these factors. The 1600 eruption of the Huayna Putina volcano in Peru pushed a lot more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which resulted in strange weather patterns, disruptions to agriculture and famine, for instance, in Russia. European colonization in the Americas, like colonization in other parts of the world, meant viruses and bacteria were introduced into populations who had no resistance to them, resulting in widespread deaths. Deaths from previously unknown diseases in the Americas in the 1500s were so extensive that many farms were abandoned, natural vegetation took over, and the carbon cycle for the entire world was slightly disrupted, according to data analyzed by these researchers. As a result, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere during the approximately 200 years before the start of the Industrial Revolution was slightly lower than they would have been without the colonization of the Americas. This also meant temperatures around the world were lowered slightly. This is the opposite of the climate change we see currently, but the dynamics are similar. But the really big changes came with the Industrial Revolution. It all started with our ability to mine coal in better but often more dangerous ways. And as you have probably already read, the Industrial Revolution started in Britain. Coal has been used around the world as a fuel for thousands of years, but in a limited way due to very basic mining methods. In 1600, around 10% of Britain's energy came from coal, mostly coal that was easily available near the surface. Nearly all the rest of Britain's energy came from burning wood and the energy used by animals and humans who did work that would gradually be taken over by machines powered by fossil fuels. By 1700, 50% of Britain's energy was coming from coal, and then by 1900, it had become 95%. After 1900, the figure dropped a bit as coal was to some extent replaced by other fossil fuels, in particular oil. (1700 to 1820), the technological foundations of the Industrial Revolution. I'm pretty sure you've heard of the importance of new technologies such as the steam engine in bringing about the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines employed in, for instance, spinning machines and locomotives required vast quantities of coal. It became possible to mine coal more economically during this period because ways of sinking or making vertical mine shafts improved. This also made mining far more dangerous. The additional coal that could be mined also made steel production easier. Fortunately, for those of us wanting to put numbers to early industrialization, many different researchers have looked at the growth in the use of coal and in technologies such as the steam engine to estimate the emissions of greenhouse gases, the most important of which has been carbon dioxide, per country over time. The particular data that I'll use to build this graph is the Primap HIST data, which goes back to 1750. These data are freely available in Excel and could easily be used in the secondary school history classroom. In fact, I would say these data provide us with perhaps the best picture possible of how quickly the Industrial Revolution unfolded in different countries across the world. I've already referred to total carbon dioxide emissions for the world. We saw earlier that this came to 37 billion or 37,000 million tons in around 2020. 200 years before that, back in 1820, this figure was much, much lower at just 60 million tons, or 0.2% of what we see today. But it had been increasing from almost nothing. In 1700, the figure was just 10 million, according to Primap HIST. According to the data, Britain was by far the biggest emitter during the early years of industrialization. But it was not completely alone. By 1820, Belgium was the second largest emitter. The United States was still a tiny player at this stage. By 1820, there was in fact almost no industrialization of the fossil fuel kind outside Western Europe. But if we look at later years in the data, we'll see that in 1890, the United States became the world's biggest emitter of carbon dioxide, while in 2005, China replaced the United States. This reflects in many ways how economic power has shifted around the world. Let's look a bit more closely at what was happening in Britain. We don't have good poverty data for this period, but what we do know is that the population of Britain increased from 8 million here to 18 million here. By the way, in 2024, the population of the country was 68 million. I get these historical population figures from another nice set of data that could be used in the classroom, though they are a bit more difficult to navigate than the PrimUpHist data. I'm referring to the History Database of the Global Environment, or HYDE. So we see the population in Britain increased by 125%. For the rest of the world, the increase was 63%. So the population in Britain increased around twice as fast as in the rest of the world over this period. This was no accident. Early industrialization in Britain came with some improvements in the standard of living of many people, even if those who benefited most from the process were a relatively small class of capitalist industrialists, the owners of the mines, factories, and so on. But across the population as a whole, more children survived to adulthood as a result of slightly better living conditions. It was in fact this type of population increase which encouraged the movement of many British people to British colonies around the world. At the time, there were worries about smoke pollution from the increased burning of coal, for instance, in factories. Remember, we're dealing with a period when electricity did not exist yet, so smoke pollution would have been something many had to suffer. This pollution caused, among other things, lung problems for both the rich and the poor. Specifically, things like soot and sulfur dioxide released when coal is burnt is harmful to humans. But what no one talked about, because it was basically invisible, was the emission of carbon dioxide. Though we know today that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is largely responsible for climate change, a bit more of this gas in the atmosphere has no direct negative effects on human health. We would have to wait almost 2 centuries before discovering the effects of this invisible carbon dioxide on the climate. So here's a question: is carbon dioxide pollution? Most experts would in fact agree that the answer is no, because slightly higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere pose no immediate danger for human health. Yet these higher levels of carbon dioxide can nonetheless kill indirectly through climate change, which can include, for instance, floods. All this can be a bit confusing.